In ancient Sparta, when a child was born, it was brought before a council of elders. The elders examined it. If they judged it strong, healthy enough to become what Sparta needed, the child was returned to its family. If they judged it weak, the child was left on a hillside outside the city. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the opening statement of a philosophy that ran through every aspect of Spartan life, that the individual existed to serve the collective, and that a collective strength began at birth, not at the moment someone decided to build it. The children who passed that first test and survived to age 7 entered a system unlike anything else in the ancient world. They called it the Agoge. What it produced was the finest infantry the ancient world ever encountered. What it cost the people who went through it is the subject of this video. At 7 years old, Spartan boys were taken from their families, not removed by force, delivered. Their parents brought them to the Agoge because the Agoge was what Spartan parents raised their sons to enter. The delivery was not a farewell. It was the moment the real work began. The boys were organized into groups, called Ilai, meaning herds. Each herd lived together, trained together, competed together, and slept together in the same barracks for the next decade. The barracks were not comfortable. That was a deliberate design choice. Comfort was understood by the Spartans not as a reward, but as a liability, a thing that softened the body and the will simultaneously, that made men prefer their bed to the battlefield, that made them choose survival over duty when the two came into conflict. So there were no soft beds. The boys cut reeds from the banks of the Eurotas River with their bare hands, no tools permitted, and used the reeds as their sleeping surface. Winter and summer, the same reeds, the same floor. They were issued a single cloak, one garment for all seasons. In the brutal summers of the Peloponnese, and through the cold of the Greek winter, one cloak was what they had. They learned to regulate their bodies with it, or they didn't, and they dealt with the consequences. They walked barefoot, always, on the roads, on the training grounds, on the rocky hillsides where they ran their drills, bare feet on stone and earth for years, until the feet themselves became something other than what most human feet are. These were not punishments handed down for failure. They were the baseline, the conditions under which every boy began, regardless of his father's rank or his family's wealth. A Spartan king's son slept on the same reeds as a farmer's son. That was also a deliberate choice. The boys of the Agoge were deliberately underfed, not starved, fed enough to train, to grow, to function, but always hungry, always slightly short of what the body was asking for. The reason was specific. Hunger sharpens. A body that is slightly underfed stays alert, stays motivated, stays attuned to its environment in a way that a comfortable, well-fed body does not. The Spartans had observed this, in animals, in themselves, and built it into the system. But the Agoge did not simply impose hunger. It gave the boys a sanctioned response to it: theft. Boys were permitted, encouraged, to steal food from the helots, the enslaved population that farmed Sparta's land. If they stole successfully and were not caught, they ate. If they were caught, they were punished. Not for stealing, for being caught. The lesson was not that theft was acceptable. The lesson was that resourcefulness, stealth, and execution mattered more than the abstract morality of the act. A warrior who could not feed himself in enemy territory, who could not move without being seen, take what was needed without being caught, was a warrior with a limitation that could get others killed. The system trained the limitation out of them. The story that Plutarch preserved, and that historians have debated for centuries, is of a boy who stole a young fox and hid it under his cloak. When confronted by an adult who demanded to know what he was concealing, the boy said nothing. The fox, hidden under the cloak, began to claw and bite him. The boy did not flinch, did not cry out, did not reveal the fox. He died from the wounds before he was discovered. Whether the story is literally true is debated. What it documents is what the Agoge valued: the ability to endure pain in silence, without breaking, for as long as the situation required. The physical training of the Agoge was what most people know. The wrestling, the running, the combat drills, the endurance marches. But the physical training was not the point. It was the method, the point. What the Spartans were actually building through every cold night and every empty stomach and every barefoot mile was a specific psychological state. One that the ancient world had no exact word for, but that we can describe precisely. The complete separation of discomfort from the decision to continue. Most human beings, when they encounter pain, hunger, cold, or exhaustion, experience those things as signals, as instructions from the body to the mind that something needs to change. Rest, eat, warm up, stop. A man who has been cold for every winter of his childhood still feels the cold, but he no longer receives it as an instruction. It is simply information, present, acknowledged, irrelevant to the decision being made. This is what 10 years of the Agoge built. Not men who didn't feel pain. Men for whom pain had stopped being a reason to stop. The Spartans were also famous for something that sounds almost opposite to their brutal training: brevity of speech. The word laconic, meaning short, precise, direct, comes from Laconia, Sparta's region. Spartan boys were trained to speak exactly as much as was needed and nothing more. Long speeches were considered a form of weakness, a sign that the speaker needed words to compensate for something they lacked in action. When a Macedonian general sent a message to Sparta saying, "If I enter your territory, I will level your city to the ground," the Spartan response was a single word: if. The final test of the Agoge, the passage from boy to warrior, was called the Krypteia. Around the age of 18, a young Spartan was sent out into the countryside, alone, no equipment, no food, no shelter. He was to survive by his own means for an extended period, living off the land, moving only at night, avoiding detection. Some historical sources describe the Krypteia as involving the killing of helots, the Spartan slave class, particularly those considered dangerous or rebellious. The historical record on this is debated, and scholars disagree on the extent and nature of the practice. What is not debated is the psychological function of the Krypteia, regardless of its specific requirements. A young man who has survived alone in the dark for months, who has fed himself, hidden himself, navigated without assistance, made decisions with no one to consult and no one to blame, returns to the city as a fundamentally different person than the one who left. The Agoge had trained him in groups for a decade. The Krypteia removed the group entirely. It tested whether the training had gone deep enough to function in absolute isolation, whether the warrior existed independently of his unit or only as a component of it. The ones who came back were warriors in the complete sense the Spartans intended, not just trained, made. The Agoge was not just building individual warriors, it was building a unit. Boys who enter the same herd at age 7 and live together for over a decade, sharing the same deprivation, the same cold, the same hunger, the same training, develop a bond that has no equivalent in ordinary life. Every man in the herd has watched every other man fail and recover, has seen him cold and exhausted and still moving, has trained beside him until the training stopped being something they chose and became something they simply were. This is what the phalanx required. A phalanx, the Spartan battle formation, depended entirely on every man holding his position. Your shield protected not you, but the man to your left. His shield protected you. The formation was only as strong as the trust between every pair of men standing in it. A warrior who broke and ran didn't just die. He uncovered the man next to him. He started a collapse that could kill everyone. The Agoge had spent 10 years making sure that the man next to you in the phalanx was not a stranger. He was someone you had slept on the same reeds with, someone you had been cold beside, someone you had trained until you knew his body as well as your own. Leaving him, breaking the line, was not just cowardice. It was betraying someone you had spent your whole life beside. The Spartans had made the social cost of breaking higher than the physical cost of staying. The Agoge produced something the modern world has no clear equivalent for. Not strength. Gyms produce strength. Not skill. Coaches produce skill. Not toughness. Experience produces toughness. The Agoge produced identity. A man who had gone through it from age 7 to adulthood did not think of himself as someone who had been trained to be a warrior. He thought of himself as a warrior, as something that was true about him the same way his name was true about him. Not a role he performed, a thing he was. That distinction mattered at Thermopylae. When Xerxes threatened the Spartans with death, he was threatening men for whom death had been a present reality since age 7. Men who had spent their entire lives training their response to it. He was threatening them with something they had already spent 20 years making peace with. It did not have the intended effect. The question the Agoge asks, the question it has been asking across 25 centuries, is not whether this level of training is appropriate or desirable for a modern life. It is how much of what you believe you cannot endure is actually just something you have never been required to endure. The Spartan answer was to find out systematically from age 7, so that by the time the answer mattered, in a narrow pass, outnumbered, with no way out, the question had already been answered. The Agoge ended with each warrior approximately 20 years old, trained, tested, and shaped into something that would not bend past the point of breaking in the places that mattered. They had spent their entire childhood being made. At Thermopylae, the world found out what had been made. Subscribe to the Bushido Code. The series continues. Marcus Aurelius next, a Roman emperor who built himself through philosophy the way the Spartans built their warriors through the Agoge. Different method, same question, the same answer.